Welcome to everybody to the Behavioral Science Authors Series, which is brought to you by the Behavior Change for Good initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, which Angela and I co-direct. I'm Katie Milkman. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, and I co-direct the initiative that I just introduced. And I'm joined by Angela Duckworth, who just shared that fabulous joke. She's a professor at Wharton and of psychology and the co-director of the Behavior Change for Good initiative. And today we are thrilled to have Don Moore of the Berkeley Haas School of Business and Max Bazerman of Harvard Business School join us to discuss their new book, Decision Leadership. And we're really delighted that Barry Schwartz, who's a visiting professor at the Berkeley Haas School of Business and professor emeritus at Swarthmore College, just down the street from us here in Philadelphia, will be leading today's conversation with our authors. Don, Max, Barry, thank you all so much for joining us today. And to our audience, please put your questions in the Q&A so we can ask them of Don and Max after the initial segment where Barry will be asking some of his own questions. So I'm going to go off camera and let these amazing guests do their thing, and I will see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Angela.
So are you guys ready to dive in?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Ready as we'll ever be.
So let me just say, I read this book in manuscript form. I think it's a fantastic book. It's beautifully written. It's really important. It's astonishing that a book like this hasn't already been written, but now we have it. So I'm going to ask you softball questions mostly because I really think you've done a wonderful thing. So I'm sort of arbitrarily going to direct the questions at one or the other of you. So feel free to ignore who I'm asking and answer in any way you want. The book's called Decision Leadership, which combines two words that are from what have traditionally been different fields, different research literatures. So the question is this a leadership book or is it a decision-making book? Let me ask this to Don.
Thanks, Barry. The answer is, of course, yes. In considering the role that leaders play in helping facilitate successful decisions by those that they work with, we're building on the enormous research progress that has been made in recent decades, understanding decision-making and the biases that it's vulnerable to, understanding behavioral economics and the ways in which people can be nudged towards making more rational decisions that serve their interests, the interests of their teams, the interests of their organizations, and the interests of the larger society better. In our book, we attempt to integrate those literatures and draw from that integration useful guidance for people who want to help facilitate the success of those around them, including those who work with and for them.
I would simply add that we think that the content is going to be very comfortable to those in the decision-making area and the behavioral economics area, and they'll see a set of extensions having to do with the leadership function. But I think our goal is to really convey to leaders and people who study leadership the importance of a decision-making perspective and the fact that in the current economy, the most important thing that leaders can influence in others are the decisions that other people make. So while Don, I think, correctly answered yes to your either or, if I had to pick, I'd go with it's a leadership book, because that's really what we want to affect. And we use the tools of decision-making and behavioral economics to help provide a pathway for that.
Well, I mean, my perspective, knowing more about decision-making than I do about leadership, would be to agree with what you just said, Max. What was surprising to me was not what you said about decision-making, but what its implications were for leadership. And on that, Max, you could tackle this one. You suggest that leaders really need to have a kind of humility, that their job should be not to make decisions for others, but to help others make better decisions themselves. And what I'm wondering about is how this view relates to the kind of standard picture of leadership and what it would say about our, quote, pantheon of great leaders from the past.
Yeah, so obviously the great man theories of leadership was a pretty failed direction in the leadership literature. But yet the hearts and minds, changing people's hearts and minds has remained core to the leadership function. And what we think is important is to think about an organization as a decision factory where the leader's trying to create better decisions. So we don't have that many people running around a lot of our organizations anymore, moving heavy objects from one side to the other. The goal isn't to get them to move faster. The goal is to get wiser decisions out of lots of people. And for the leader to think about how they can help facilitate that by creating the right direction, by figuring out how to put the right information together, how to use crowdsourcing, how to find out who in the organization can provide the best input for a wise decision, seems absolutely critical to leading an effective organization in today's economy.
Does this mean, you can try this, Don, does this mean that we essentially be kicking most of the members of the Leadership Hall of Fame out and replacing them with a different set of people?
It might mean that we think differently about what constitutes success and the most desirable aspects of someone in the leadership role. The humility that you describe is essential to the way we think about effective leadership, where the leader who seizes control in order to try to make all the decisions themselves because they think they know best, is not going to be taking advantage of the wisdom and the abilities that surround them in the organization. What you want as a good leader is to hire excellent people and to empower them to make wise decisions.
Sounds good to me. So let me ask you this. You both teach at business schools that I gather, I'm an outsider, I gather these are highly prestigious business schools. So you're supposed to be training future leaders of organizations. Do you think that the current MBA curricula, the typical MBA curriculum, actually succeeds in doing that? Or do you think that the way we imagine MBA training needs to be substantially revisioned?
You go, Max.
Sorry.
I think that we do a good job on lots of fronts, but I think we can do a better job on other fronts. So it's, really since the fall of Enron, the business schools kind of accepted the task of helping create more ethical leaders. So that was something that was certainly missing, but I think we're moving clearly in the right direction on that. 20 years ago, there weren't that many business schools who had a substantial focus on improving the quality of decisions made by the employees within the organization. I think that that's changed. And I think that our goal is to help refine the idea of what it means to teach people to have the humility to be a great leader. So Barry, I'm optimistic about the potential of business schools to help make things better. But I think we have certainly made a variety of mistakes in the past. If you remember back 20 years ago when Enron collapsed and there were a number of other scandals, people looked at business schools and said, why are you creating these people making those mistakes? Well, I don't think any of us know how to completely eliminate the likelihood that there will be wrongdoers in our environment. But I think that we've been moving in the right direction. I think we can make a significant adjustment upwards in what we do in the future. So I would say we get questionable marks in the distant past. We get improving marks in recent history. And I think we have the upside potential to do even better. But I think that that the economy can benefit by well-trained leaders. And I think business schools probably have a part to play in that process.
And we very much hope that our book can contribute to that.
So apropos of that, I was surprised at how often ethics showed up in the book, really on a regular basis. Why is there so much about, let's think about Milton Friedman, who would probably be turning over in his grave as he read this book. And
we certainly hope so.
Well, I'm on your side on this one. But, you know, there's a certain sense in which your job is to maximize ROI, and then with all of your wealth, you can be an ethical citizen, but not an ethical business person. So I was surprised at how thoroughly this was a book about ethics. You couldn't separate the ethical dimensions from the other dimensions. Obviously, this was deliberate. And I'm wondering if it's also sort of radical. Don?
So leadership is inherently an interpersonal activity where the interests of the collective are part and parcel of its effective exercise. As such, it makes complete sense for leaders to be thinking about the larger consequences of their actions. And it is also obviously the case that businesses these days are increasingly concerned about the ways that the stakeholders that care about their operations, who are influenced by their work, how those stakeholders are influenced by the decisions made within the organization, and the organizations that neglect those interests do so at their own peril. We see among our students an increasing interest in the ethical implications of their work and a desire to work for organizations and for leaders who prioritize those ethical concerns. So when Milton Friedman opined that a business's job is to maximize the net cash flow of its shareholders, that was his opinion. It was never law. And I think there's ample reason to question whether it even is a good manifestation of the rational intentions and the interests that most corporate leaders hold.
So let me pursue this a little bit. In the last week, a lot of stuff has come out suggesting that a significant contributor to inflation that we are currently experiencing is that people who run large companies have decided that inflation is a great cover for the unbridled increase in prices, all of which can be blamed on inflation. And they report to shareholders that profits have never been higher. He. So if you were a shareholder at one of these shareholder meetings and you heard a report like this, what would you say, Max?
Well, I think that the organization should think about at a point of crisis, should we be only maximizing shareholder value? So I could imagine that these organizations are in fact maximizing shareholder return by increasing prices under the cover of the Ukraine invasion and the aftermath of COVID and the supply chain disruptions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's obviously good reason for prices to go up, but you're really referring to using it as cover for them to go up even more than the logic should dictate. And
Yeah.
The question is sort of, is this the story that you want to read about on the front page of the newspaper, that you're a senior leader in an organization that acts in this particular way? And if the answer is no, then I think then that would imply that you care about something other than simply maximizing shareholder value, and that you realize that society cares about something more than maximizing shareholder value, and that you might care about government not being motivated to intervene in how your organization does business because of the gouging that you're creating. So consistent with what Don said, there were lots of actual ethicists before Milton Friedman who thought about ethical behavior in terms of a broader constituency of the self or the organization. And we think that that belongs in the current discussion as well. I mean, for me, the biggest problem with Milton Friedman was that he went from being economist to self-proclaimed ethicist, and people believed him, and went on to become sort of a self-proclaimed legal expert by convincing people that it was a legal obligation to maximize shareholder value when that was never the law. The quick answer to your question, Barry, yeah, as a shareholder, I want the organization that I'm invested in to act with interests that move far beyond shareholder value.
John, you got anything to add?
Nope. Max said
Okay,
it
let me
well.
ask one more question on this ethical theme, which happens to be a hobby horse of mine. Do you have guidelines to offer, more concrete guidelines to offer about exactly how ethical dimensions are to be weighed against more routine ROI dimensions? Are there, for example, taboo trade-offs? Are there rules of thumb that leaders and organizations should be using so that they know what the proper weight to assign to the ethical dimensions of their policies?
Great question. Yeah. So ethics are fundamentally about how our decisions affect others. So what are the externalities generated by, for instance, profit-seeking behavior by corporations? And I think that the chapter in our book on negotiation provides some useful guideposts here, where we encourage decision makers to think about making integrative deals, deals that maximize the aggregate benefit by pushing toward the Pareto optimal frontier. Decisions that are more efficient for all concerned by considering their interests and trying to make decisions that leave the collective, all stakeholders collectively, better off. So the challenge with ethical decision-making is that it's possible sometimes to make decisions without all of those stakeholders at the table. We're encouraging decision makers and organizations to take the longer view and include those perspectives, even when the specific individuals, for instance, future generations, aren't going to be physically present at the table to help make the decision. Max, what would you add?
Yeah, so I think that you want to think about who's the person you want to be. And I've always, well, over the last decade, I'm increasingly motivated by the work of the philosopher Peter Singer, who talks about enlarging circles. And if you think about someone who just tries to maximize their commissions at the expense of the organization, we think that that's bad. If we maximize our unit at the expense of the overall organization, that's bad. And I think Singer would argue, and well, I'll argue, gaining insight from him, that as we move beyond the organization and think about how to make decisions that not only maintain the organization as a productive member of society at a profitable level, but also think about how to make the organization an important contributor to making society better off, the more ethical we are. But I also want to highlight that this isn't just an ethics book. We mean it as a leadership and decision-making book. We just simply think that too often we compartmentalize ethics, and we think that ethics should be one important ingredient of what it means to make wise decisions, and in terms of what leaders can do to create wise decisions. And we think that leaders need to think about ethics in order to make wise decisions.
I mean, one of the aspects of leadership is that leaders are in a position to take the broader view. They often have access to information about the interests of the larger organization, or even the stakeholders that an organization is relating to. And insofar as they have that broader view, they are empowered to help the people who they work with to understand those other perspectives and those stakeholder interests.
No, I certainly understood that, this is not it is an ethics book, but I understand that it's not only an ethics book. Relating to a question I asked a few minutes ago, it has bothered me in the several years now that I've been teaching at a business school that there's a class on business ethics. And what I tell the students in the class that I teach is that that's foolish, that what that does is ghettoize something that should be a part of every class. And what I assume you would argue is that ethics should be a part of every decision. And if you decide that it's not ethically relevant, that's itself a decision about the ethical implications of what you're about to do. In which case, every class in a business school is in some sense a business ethics class, whatever else it may be.
So I wouldn't use the word foolish, just because if other people aren't going to talk about ethics, then we want it in the curriculum. So there may be reasons why schools will
Fair
take that as a second best solution. But I certainly agree with your broader comment. The preferred state would be to have ethics run throughout the curriculum. And if we assume that this book is not an ethics book, I think I have published 2 prior books on ethics, and yet I don't teach ethics as a course, and I don't aspire to teach ethics as a course. I infuse ethics when I teach decision making and negotiation on a regular basis. So I think that I'm very much in sync with your preferred state, Barry.
I would have guessed it from the book itself. Let me switch gears. I don't want our audience to think that you're moral philosophers disguised as well-played business school professors. Let's talk about intuition. Jack Welch endorsed intuition. Malcolm Gladwell argued that many of our best decisions and worst decisions are intuitive. And you guys seem not to be on that bandwagon. Are you against intuition? And reading your discussions of this topic reminded me of the debate / dispute / collaboration that occurred some years ago between Danny Kahneman and Gary Klein, who had very different views about intuition. And Klein, Danny is all about how when you go with your gut, you're almost certainly going to get it wrong. And Klein's view is that if you go with your gut and your gut is educated, you're often going to get it right. And so the question is there a distinction to be made between educated intuition and uneducated intuition? And would you encourage business schools and leaders to cultivate and nurture the education of intuition so that decisions can be made quickly and effectively and often be good decisions?
I'm sure you will recall, Barry, that Gary Klein and Danny Kahneman wound up making up and wound up friends at the end of that exchange. I wouldn't say that we are against intuition. We are in favor of assigning it its proper role in the decision-making process. Intuition is powerful and effective, and as you point out, efficient at making decisions quickly. It is also possible to train it such that its guidance is by and large effective. We know many of the conditions under which it is possible to train intuition, lots and lots of practice with clear feedback. There are some circumstances, some professional circumstances in which we get that sort of training and in which intuition becomes a fairly useful guide. The risk of relying on intuition is that it is vulnerable to the sorts of biases and errors that Kahneman in his research with Amos Tversky has identified so clearly. And the problem is that because intuition emerges whole from unconscious processes into which we lack conscious access, it's hard for us to audit that decision process to check the degree to which biases like representativeness or availability have tarnished the intuitive sense that feels so right when it emerges into our conscious minds. And so that suggests caution that intuition's place in decision-making must be married with more rigorous quantitative, conscious, systematic analysis, especially when the stakes are high and you have the time to deliberate.
I would add, Barry, I think you're capturing some of our views about what we prescribe. Neither of us would deny the fact that we use intuition all the time. And neither of us would deny the fact that Gary Klein's firefighter doesn't have the time to do a careful decision tree. They need to act. So there's going to be times where we simply don't have the opportunity for precise quantifiable analysis. And there's times when it's just not worth it. So when you go to the grocery store, it takes too long to do a careful analysis on every item that you purchase. So undoubtedly, we use intuition all the time. What we're arguing is that the vast majority of the evidence suggests that for important decisions, you're going to be better off with using your system 2 thinking either instead of system one or in addition to system one, but system one thinking and Kahneman or Stanovich and West's language is going to be insufficient for lots of your important decisions. I would also highlight that somehow the notion that when you question intuition, people don't like it. But when we say, Barry, we're questioning your intuition, we're questioning Barry's intuition against Barry's more deliberative thought processes. And if you ask me, you're making an important decision, okay, whether to operate or not, whether to marry that other person or not, some deliberation might add some value to the quality of the decision that you're making on those important questions.
Mm-hmm. So to summarize, the view seems to be that a good watchword for people is don't just do something, sit there. That is
absolutely,
to say,
yeah.
Unless you're under pressure to make rapid decisions, you should at least let system two inspect the output of system one and do as much of an audit as it can. I'm wondering though, to get back in this, and then I'll open it up to the audience, to get back to the ethical side of things, whether it might not be true that for most people, many people, their ethical intuitions are more reliable than their ethical deliberations, because these intuitions are the product of years and years of socialization. I would sometimes, when somebody would ask me about how to make decisions that have ethical consequences in a business setting, I would say, well, here's a question you can ask yourself before you decide. Would you tell your children? And if the answer to that question is no, don't do it. Now, that's hardly reasoned, but it strikes me as a pretty decent first pass when you're faced with decisions that may have ethical implications. And you don't necessarily need to be able to say why you wouldn't tell your children. But if it makes you sort of creepy that your children are about to know something of this particular thing about you, then maybe you shouldn't do it. And that's coming from the gut. That's not coming from any sort of analytical. So I'm thinking that maybe in certain aspects of the decision, the gut is more reliable than most people's rational faculties are. Not all, but some.
I think you're tapping something really important there, Barry. And I would agree that the source of people's ethical preferences, and all of us have strong ethical preferences, that in tracing their origins, we pretty quickly get to an intuitive sense of what's right and wrong. But there too, I would note that our ethical preferences are vulnerable to biases. So Kahneman has talked about scope neglect, how people are, they don't distinguish very well between causes with high impact. They give as much to save 200,000 endangered animals as to protect 200 endangered animals, right? So although our intuition provides a sense of the importance of the issue, it doesn't scale properly with the size or the scope. And then there are all the perversities that Paul Slovic has identified in the way in which an individual case, especially one with a compelling story, arouses our compassion and elicits the motivation to help more than a large-scale tragedy, right? So when a problem scales up, and instead of just one child being at risk of death by starvation, instead there are hundreds of thousands or millions of children at risk, our intuitive sense loses its ability to capture the scope of the issue. And so introducing a little bit of system two deliberative review of our intuitive ethical responses can help us think about how to respond more effectively.
So Barry, in your question, I thought you gave an anecdote of a time when you wanted to use your intuition as a input into deliberation about what you would want your grandchildren to think. I would simply add to some of the summaries that Don provided. I think our book does a pretty good job of suggesting that our deliberative self makes, on average, better decisions than our intuitive self. I think we also, and it's sort of inconsistent with sort of an assumption in your question, I think we provide lots of evidence that our deliberative self makes more ethical decisions than our intuitive self.
Well, that's an interesting, I guess, it may be empirical question. It sort of depends on who the R refers to. I kind of like Don's model, which is you don't, you're not completely suspicious and dismissive of intuitions, but all intuitions require inspection. And if you know some of the problems that you guys enumerate in the book, you know exactly what things to inspect your intuitions for, because you know what kinds of errors you're liable to make.
Such a nice summary. Thank you. We approve.
In that event, since I've given such a nice summary, let's open this up to the wider world.
So I see 4 thumbs up on anonymous attendees' question. How do you define better decisions in the scope of this book?
Yeah, I like that question. Better decisions serve the interests of the affected people better. So we are concerned about the welfare and utility of the decision maker, the people who that decision affects, their team, their organization, and the broader society. So we aspire to encourage leaders to make decisions that make the world better off by maximizing the utility, pushing closer to the Pareto optimal frontier. What would you add to that, Max?
I agree.
Okay, I found the questions.
All right.
Does the widespread use of social media for activism on the part of non-shareholders change the calculus of what makes for good decisions by leaders?
I hope so. I think having other voices become salient so that we understand the interests of the broader society, that seems very, very helpful. Now, obviously, we could have social activists who we agree with or don't agree with, but do I think it's great for boards of directors and shareholders and executives to understand a broader audience? Absolutely.
What we don't have is data that provides some sort of systematic test of whether the presence of social media actually makes organizational decisions better. But in principle, I'm in complete agreement with Max's argument.
This could be a moving target, it strikes me. The early enthusiasm for social media and its positive effects on sort of social progress has kind of been replaced in the last couple of years by a much more pessimistic view of what social media contribute.
Yeah.
Another question. Adam Grant writes in his book, and I was going to ask you this question like this, but we ran out of time. Adam Grant writes in his latest book, Think Again, about being a scientist. How do you create space for employees to feel empowered to take the scientist approach? And in your book, it seems to me what this connects to is your encouraging of organizations and leaders to be experimenters. Max,
this one's for you.
Sure. So I think that there's 2 pieces there. So first of all, I like Adam's writing, and I like the specific idea that's being addressed. So I think that there's 2 pieces. You know, scientists think systematically. They deliberate. They look at the evidence rather than using their intuition alone. And scientists also run experiments, particularly in the social sciences and in medicine. In our book, we argue that many more leaders should be thinking about the use of actual controlled experiments in their organization. We certainly see a proliferation of the use of experiments in the tech sector. We see a proliferation of the use of experiments in government led by the behavioral insights team out of the UK. But I think that there's not enough attention among old line corporations to the power of experiments. I'm always stunned by the fact that it's easier to convince a CEO that my ideas are good than to convince them that my ideas might be good, but it's still worth testing them before you roll them out across the overall organization. So I think thinking like a scientist has a lot of merit, particularly on the front in terms of experimentation and deliberation.
Another question. What else needs to be in place to allow people at all levels to make decisions? As we consider how to move toward anti-racism at my organization, it will require sharing power, growth mindset, and psychological safety. But we don't have the culture or the structure set up to support those things.
What we haven't talked enough about yet today is the leader as decision architect, and the way that the leader builds the situation that can empower or disempower others from making decisions, can guide the way toward a consideration of relevant facts and evidence so that may look like empowering those who are interested in running experiments, as Max was just talking about. It can take the form of empowering people to make choices instead of one at a time, individual choices, to think broadly about the context of alternatives that they have and the set of people they're hiring, for instance, which can increase the salience of issues like the full diversity of the set of candidates that they're thinking about hiring. The core lesson of the book Nudge is that by simple restructuring of the decision environment, that can have a powerful influence on the decisions that people make. That is, of course, the core lesson from the situationist perspective in social psychology, that we are powerfully influenced by the situations in which we operate, and leaders are uniquely positioned to be able to structure those situations in a way that enhances the effectiveness and the ease of making effective decisions by the people in their organizations.
I couldn't help but think of today, in today's newspaper, there's an article on the front page, Wells Fargo, just when you thought it couldn't possibly do anything more wrong, it turns out they have this diversity campaign, and they interview diverse candidates after they've offered the job, no doubt to a white man. So I'm just wondering,
it's tragic.
I'm wondering if they're ever going to do something right again at that bank. Okay, another question. Do boards have more responsibility for pushing for ethical decision-making than shareholders or customers or stakeholders? Do boards play a uniquely important role?
Yes. So we've created a variety of watchdog functions, from boards to audit firms. But sticking with boards, yeah, it's a board's job to take their job seriously, even in not-for-profit organizations where people often become board members because they've donated rather than because of their governance wisdom. But I think that all board members should take their job very seriously. If you agree to be on a board of any organization, it's your obligation to provide oversight, not just on profitability or how many meals are served if it's a not-for-profit, but on the ethicality of the actions of the executives.
Mm-hmm. And this is a question that actually occurred to me as I was planning my questions. Is it important that we all be leaders? In what kinds of scenarios would it be beneficial to be a follower?
Our book encourages readers to take an expansive view of leadership, recognizing the ways in which they structure the decision environments, that they serve as decision architects for people around them, even those who nominally rank above them, but also thinking about people who may not necessarily be thinking of themselves as leaders, parents, for instance. And remind me of your question again, Barry.
Do we all need to be leaders?
Do we all need to be leaders? Well, no. So there are lots. If we're all leaders, then the concept of what leadership means sort of loses some of its value. There are lots of circumstances in which there has to be a coordinating function, and its value is lost if nobody plays along with that coordinating function. In our book, we talk about the value of collecting the wisdom of the crowd and the importance of a leader accepting input from others. In that circumstance, not everybody can be the leader aggregating that input. The one who collects those inputs and aggregates them to a coordinated decision based on the wisdom of the collective is in a unique position.
Max, anything to add?
I agree. I think that many of us can do a better job of realizing in some cases we need to lead, and sometimes we need to turn the task over to other people who can do a better job than we can and follow.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Barry, did you notice how I just changed the architecture of this webinar by appearing?
Absolutely.
Here?
You are our decision leader.
I was trying to
Angela.
make it easier for us to remember that this is like close to the end of the time we have here, and I'll take the prerogative then to say thank you, Don and Max, and a special thank you to Barry. I thought this was a terrific conversation, and one thing that I'm going to take with me from the book and also from this conversation, leaders really are decision architects, and there's just so much insight into decision architecture that I think leaders can make use of. So fantastic conversation, fantastic book. And I'm also going to take the prerogative to close us for the season. So we hope that you have enjoyed the BCFG Behavioral Science Authors Series. I think this is a rousing finale. So again, thank you, Barry, Max, and Don. We've had a wonderful time learning from you and from the other brilliant BCFG team scientists. If you are wanting to stay in the loop on future BCFG events, there are two ways. One is to subscribe to the BCFG newsletter. Our website is easily Googleable, but I'll ask if anybody on our team could add the URL. And also, you can follow us on Twitter. And so thank you again. And I hope everyone stays safe and doesn't forget, we are all, in some ways, I take your point, Don, but I think in some ways we're all leaders of some team or another, including our families. So thank you for reminding us of our responsibilities as decision architects.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Fun.